if the monetary mistakes from 2001 to 2008 resulted in the Great Recession, how could anybody believe that we're going to get away with no recession at all this time? Whatever we have, it's going to be much worse than what we had in 2007 and 2008. So it may have already started. But what's really going to worsen this crisis is the inflation problem that is going to be pernicious, that we didn't even have really back then. And I think we're going to end up with a sovereign debt crisis, which is a lot worse than a mortgage crisis, because in the mortgage crisis, it was, mortgages that went bad.
In this compelling analysis, financial expert Peter Schiff warns of an impending crisis in the U.S. economy, supported by data highlighting significant economic imbalances. Schiff points to the magnitude of trade and budget deficits, as well as the unprecedented household debt levels. He emphasizes the disconnect between official statistics and the real economic struggles faced by individuals working multiple jobs with minimal savings. Schiff anticipates a market downturn, urging viewers to be proactive in their preparations. He identifies key indicators to watch, particularly emphasizing the potential return to quantitative easing, QE, by the Federal Reserve and the vulnerability of Treasury bonds. Schiff contends that the current monetary policy, more reckless than pre-2008, sets the stage for a more severe crisis, possibly exacerbated by an inflation problem and the looming threat of a sovereign debt crisis.
The signs are already there that, a crisis is coming. I mean, trying to pinpoint the exact date is impossible. But if you look at what's been happening to the U.S. economy, you look at the enormity of our trade deficits and our budget deficits, these imbalances that have produced that are enormous. In fact, if you look at the popularity, or maybe that's not the right word, the lack of popularity of President Biden, there's never been a sitting president this unpopular. And, the only reason to explain that is voters are unhappy with their situation and they blame Biden, whether it's his fault or not. I mean, voters have a tendency to blame the incumbent president for the problems, and they give the incumbent president credit if things are going well. Well, the media keeps telling us, the Biden administration certainly keeps telling us that everything is great, but the polls tell us that it's not great. And, the media says that, well, there's a disconnect. Why don't the voters realize how great everything is? The disconnect isn't between the voters and the economy. It's between the statistics and the economy. The statistics don't tell you the real story. So the fact that people, are working 2 or 3 jobs, the fact that people have no savings, the fact that they've maxed out their credit cards, household debt has never been this high. This is a sign of economic stress. I mean, we don't have productive jobs anymore. We have a lot of low-paying service sector jobs. People have nothing saved. But if you want to look at, what might happen in the market to kind of say, okay, this is it, right? It's over now. The things I think are going to happen, but I think they're going to happen very abruptly. So you can't really wait for this to do something. I think you've got to be prepared in advance. You just got to, take for granted that you're probably going to be early. I mean, obviously not as early as me. I've been preparing for a long time. But you got to be early, because you can only be early. Because if you're late, well, you've missed it, and you're never going to do it, just perfectly. But I think that when you see the bond market really start to fall, maybe when the Fed goes back to QE, which I expect it to happen this year. I mean, I think the Fed, forget about rate cuts. I mean, we might get those. But I think what no one is really talking about is that we're going to go back to QE. And in fact, they're already talking about slowing down quantitative tightening. And that's like the first step to, going back to QE. But I think they're going to have to do that to stop long-term interest rates from rising and to try to help reelect Biden. But when the Fed goes back to QE, if Treasury bonds fall instead of rise, if in this next recession, when it's officially acknowledged. We may be in a recession right now. In fact, I think we probably are. And people forget about this, but the Great Recession, which we had in 2007, 2008, in the summer of 2008, before the financial crisis, nobody thought a recession was coming, let alone that we were in one. They said, oh, there's no recessions anywhere in sight. It's a Goldilocks economy. It's the greatest story never told. I mean, I was arguing with all these guys, on financial television, who were very optimistic about the Bush economy. And then we got the financial crisis, and then the government, in December of 2008, went back and revised all the economic data and said the recession started a year ago, in December of 2007. So as they were putting out all this rosy data, it turned out that none of that data was correct, because we had been in a recession the entire time. And the reason that recession was so bad was because the Fed policy that preceded it was so reckless. Greenspan lowered interest rates to 1%. They stayed there for a couple of years. They were very slow. It took a couple more years to get back up to 5%. And in the interim, we inflated a housing bubble because people took advantage of all that cheap money to bid up home prices and get over leveraged, and the banks were exposed. And we had, this massive recession, the worst recession since the Great Depression. But if you compare the monetary policy post 2008 to pre, is far more reckless than anything Greenspan did. I mean, we had 0% rates for more than a decade. We had all this quantitative easing. We blew up the balance sheet from $700 billion to $9 trillion. And even though they trimmed it a bit, it's still just below $8 trillion. So we had much more reckless policy for much longer. And therefore, the malinvestments, the misallocations of resources that took place are much greater. Now, busts are in proportion to the booms that precede them, because these booms make the busts inevitable, because that's when the market corrects the mistakes that the Fed causes. Well, if the monetary mistakes from 2001 to 2008 resulted in the Great Recession, how could anybody believe that we're going to get away with no recession at all this time? Whatever we have, it's going to be much worse than what we had in 2007 and 2008. So it may have already started. But what's really going to worsen this crisis is the inflation problem that is going to be pernicious, that we didn't even have really back then. And I think we're going to end up with a sovereign debt crisis, which is a lot worse than a mortgage crisis, because in the mortgage crisis, it was, mortgages that went bad. But this time, if it's treasuries that go bad, that's a whole different ballgame. And there's no bailouts, right? The Federal Reserve was able to bail out the economy by printing money. But if we have a sovereign debt crisis and then a dollar crisis, printing money is just going to make it worse. Everybody borrowed too much money when interest rates were artificially low. In fact, that was the Fed's goal. They tried to encourage people to go out and borrow money. That's one of the reasons they lowered rates. And so people did what the Fed wanted them to do. But now they're all levered up. And as these loans mature, what made sense, at a low rate, the numbers don't work at a higher rate, particularly for the banks. I was one of the only people, I don't know anybody else, who was out there calling out this problem, because when everybody was refinancing their mortgages, everyone in the media, oh, this is great. This is allowing households to really get their balance sheets in shape. They're locking in these really, really low mortgage rates. This is great for the economy, because that means that households have more money to spend on other things, because they're spending less on, their mortgage, because they've got a 30-year fixed rate at 3%. Well, I was saying, well, wait a minute. What's going to happen to the lenders when interest rates go up and they're stuck with all this paper? It's great for the borrower only because it's lousy for the lender. And that's the banks, whoever's holding the paper, or the U.S. government that's guaranteed the mortgages, that the taxpayers on the hook. But in the financial crisis or the housing bubble of 2008, the banks had problems with the mortgages that defaulted, which was still the minority of mortgages. Most of them didn't default. But the problem was the ones that defaulted, when they they repossessed, the foreclosed the house, and they went to sell it. They didn't get back what they loaned because prices had gone down. They loaned on bubble prices, thanks to the Fed. Well, this time, the banks are in much worse shape because it's not the defaulting mortgages that are the problem. It's all the mortgages. Because it's not houses that went down in value, it's the mortgages that went down in value, and the banks own them. And the Fed owns them on its balance sheet, all these mortgage-backed securities. So the banks have lost a fortune on these loans. That's why they can't pay their depositors any interest, because they're losing money. And the depositors want their money back so they can lend it to the government by buying a money market and getting 5%. So we have a much bigger financial problem now than we had in 2008.
As we conclude this eye-opening analysis by Peter Schiff on the imminent economic crisis in the United States, let's recap the key points. Schiff highlights alarming signs, from staggering trade and budget deficits to the growing household debt and a lack of productive jobs. He emphasizes the disconnect between official statistics and the economic realities faced by individuals. Schiff advises proactive preparation, particularly as he anticipates a return to quantitative easing by the Federal Reserve and a potential market downturn. The looming inflation problem and the possibility of a sovereign debt crisis add further gravity to the situation. We encourage you to stay informed, subscribe for more insights, and share your thoughts in the comments section below.